Yes, good afternoon. Dr. Lontrish here. This is first of three short-ish lectures for this week's material. And it's one slideshow. It's 26 slides, but I'm just going to break it up into three videos, partly because too much, too large. The files are too large. I can't put them onto YouTube easily. So they're going to be broken into three videos. One is about endocrine, well, it's really about signaling, and then a little bit about endocrine system, and then the second video is all about endocrine system, and the third video is about endocrine disruptors. Okay, let's get started. So let me begin by saying that a lot of what I have to share with you is right out of the handout and the questions that I asked on the handout. So you should have been doing some reading on this before you watch my video so that this doesn't totally shock you. But let me begin with the first question on the handout, which was about this thing here. And all I am going to say is that you are responsible for being able to tell me the story from this. And I assigned I gave you access to two readings. One's a pretty heavy article on the subject, and the other is an overview. You can read either one. And right now, I'm interested in the mechanistic basis for sex reversal in these fish. And if you look at the handout, you also know that I had this table, and I decided to fill the table in instead of work through a lecture with you on it, since I don't have that opportunity. And so this is a nice summary of various kinds of signaling modes that are present in the body. And we're going to talk about endocrine signaling mostly. We've talked about nervous system signaling already last week. And we haven't talked about, nor will we talk about paracrine signaling to any great degree. I will touch on it momentarily. And then I want to talk about pheromone signaling a little bit. And I have a question on the handout, which is, why are pheromone parties not really about pheromones? I like that question. So you should be able to figure that out based on the information I have on this slideshow. But I also, I think, invite you to type in the words pheromone parties, not pheromones, and figure it out on your own. Okay. What do I want to say? This is about paracrine communication. Well, actually, it's about paracrine communication, but it's also about autocrine communication, which is targeting the self. The cell produces something that comes back and signals to itself, triggers an event in its own cell. And there's also synaptic transmission, which is paracrine-like. But these are examples that I want you to know. And they're also, this one here is kind of interesting. How do we take the aspirin or ibuprofen for inflammation, right? What's the mechanistic basis for that? Well, it has to do with this. Those chemicals in the pills are inhibiting this enzyme, which will trigger an inflammatory response. I am not interested in having you know all this. I am interested in having you know, however, what COX-1 and 2 inhibitors are doing. They're inhibiting inflammation, and that's what aspirin and ibuprofen are targeting. There's some things here. I asked them on the handout. I summarized them for you in this slide. So I won't talk about them anymore, and nor will I expect you to know more than what is written on this slide. Now I want to talk about pheromones. So pheromones are chemicals that are emitted by a small group of animals. Insects, a lot of them produce pheromones. Crustaceans also produce them, and most vertebrates, although birds not so much. Chemicals that are emitted into the environment and are used as species-wide signals. That's a really important point. I do not want you to underestimate the value of that latter clause, as used as species-wide signals. It's not enough that a chemical is emitted into the environment. It has to actually be used as a signal for the species. Because if it wasn't used by all members of the species um, as a generic signal, then it would be something else, and it would not be a pheromone. There are other things that we could talk about in this slide. I am not going to do that for this class, partly because I don't really have the time, and partly because you already have a lot going on. But you should know semiochemicals, chemicals from outside the organism that provide information. And pheromones are one kind of semiochemical. I think that's enough for you to know. Now let's move on to the rest of this presentation. The topic that this is all mostly about is the endocrine system. And you've heard about the endocrine system in some class or another, so I hope I don't bore you with the contents of this slideshow. But I can't assume anything, and so I'm just going to begin by saying that the endocrine system involves this pathway generically, right? It's the types of glands called endocrine glands that are secreting from their cells, hormones that travel in the bloodstream and then visit target cells and trigger some event in those target cells. That's an overview of the system that you certainly want to know, and I hope most of you already do know. The system is involving or involves many organs of the body. Some of them are principally endocrine organs. Some of them are involved in other functions of the body. For example, the testes is not just an endocrine organ, or ovaries likewise. Pancreas has an endocrine function, but it also does other things too. Endocrine system has a lot more diverse set of functions than the nervous system. That's probably worth remembering. And if you go back to that, I think I had a table comparing the two systems. One of those comparisons had to do with diversity of functions, and with respect to the nervous system, it's usually contraction of muscles and the secretion of materials from glands when we think about functions of the nervous system. But with the endocrine system, it's all sorts of things. Some of them are short-term, like the fight or flight response or flight or fight response, and some of them are very long-term, like growth and reproductive development. Okay, moving on. Am I running? Is this slideshow running still? Yeah, I think so. Hormone functions. All right, so hormones, how do they work? Well, the two types of hormones and their functions, and there are three kinds of hormones that you will come across. They're peptide and amine hormones that are both water soluble. And so they both act in the same way. Insulin and epinephrine are two examples. They can induce changes in cytoplasm molecules or alter gene transcription, but they do not themselves enter the cell, right? Because they're water soluble, they cannot travel through the cell membrane. So those are two kinds and essentially one property, both water soluble. And then there's this other kind, the lipid molecules, lipid hormones, like testosterone and estrogens and cortisol. And these induce changes in gene expression, and they travel into the cell through the membrane. They bind to receptor proteins in the cytoplasm and then form a complex that then act as transcription factors in affecting gene expression inside the nucleus. So we talked about neurotransmitters last week, and we talked about hormones a little bit last weekend, certainly now beginning to this week. And we know that hormones travel through the blood, and neurotransmitters are secreted from, or I should say, exocytosed from axon terminals. And then there's this other kind of chemical called neurohormones, right? And there are neurotransmitters, and there are hormones, and then there are these what the heck's the difference? And I'm not going to even tell you. You're going to need, this is a great slide, but I'll tell you right now, it's a good test question, right? It's like, what's the difference between a neurohormone, neurotransmitter, and a hormone? Okay, enough of that. Endocrine glands. This is a good summary slide of what I want you to have as an overview of the endocrine system with respect to glands. Many organs of the body. So we typically think of these, but there are a lot of hormones produced by other organs, like for example, the stomach apparently produces hormones. So it's not really easy to identify and pin down a finite set of glands that are all part of the endocrine system. So typically people think of like 7 or 10. Here's a list that's useful to remember. These are the major endocrine glands. Hypothalamus often has been called the master endocrine gland, and one of the questions I have for you on the handout, I think, was like, in what respect is it a master? What makes it a master gland? And I like that as a test question. So in the rest of this presentation, which I think is going to begin on the next slideshow, we're going to talk about the functions associated with these glands. So for now, I'm just going to stop and move on to we'll move on to the next slideshow after this one finishes. Thank you.